Darius Cole was a man who had everything: wealth, power, and a family he adored. So when he came across a sprawling, luxurious mansion hidden in the hills, he thought it would be the perfect new home. The house was a masterpiece, with gleaming marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and vast windows that overlooked lush gardens. It was more than a house, it was a dream. The deal seemed almost too good to be true. The real estate agent, a nervous man with shifty eyes, avoided most of Darius's questions about the property's history. "It's a rare find," the agent said. "A place like this, well, it's one of a kind." Darius didn't press for details. It was already sold. The Cole family, Darius, his wife Serena, their teenage son Malik, and their little girl Lila, moved in the very next day. The first evening was filled with laughter as they explored the massive rooms and halls. But as night fell, a strange chill crept through the mansion. The first night, at midnight, Lila woke up crying. When Serena went to check on her, Lila whispered, "Mommy, there's a lady in my room." Serena froze. "What do you mean, honey?" "She's by the window." She's sad. Serena glanced at the window, but there was nothing there. "It's just your imagination," she said, trying to soothe her daughter. But as she tucked Lila back into bed, Serena couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. Meanwhile, Darius was in his office, working late. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Assuming it was Serena or one of the kids, he called out, "Who's there?" No answer. When he stepped into the hall, it was empty. But just as he turned to go back, he saw a shadow move across the far end of the corridor. "Serena," he called again, but his voice seemed to be swallowed by the silence. He shook his head and went back to his desk, dismissing it as his mind playing tricks on him. The second night, the next evening, things escalated. Malik's tablet went missing. He swore he had left it on his nightstand, but it was nowhere to be found. Hours later, Serena found it under the dining table, its screen cracked and covered in smudged fingerprints. When Malik turned it on, he gasped. The gallery was filled with photos he hadn't taken. One of them showed the family sitting at dinner the previous night, but in the background, near the doorway, a tall, shadowy figure loomed. Its face was obscured, but its hollow eyes seemed fixed on Malik. "Who took this?" Malik asked, his voice trembling. "No one," Serena whispered, her face pale. That night, Darius heard faint whispers as he walked through the mansion. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was cold and angry. The mirror incident. On the third night, Serena noticed that the mirrors in the house felt wrong. When she looked into them, her reflection seemed delayed, as if it was watching her before mimicking her movements. She tried to brush it off, but a growing unease made her avoid looking into them altogether. Darius experienced something far worse. While adjusting his tie in front of a large mirror in the hallway, he froze. His reflection didn't move. It simply stared at him with a crooked, menacing grin. Suddenly, the glass cracked, and a faint voice whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." Darius stumbled back, his heart pounding. He didn't tell Serena. He didn't want to scare her. But the incident left him shaken. The shadows closed in. That same night, the family was awoken by a loud crash. They ran to Malik's room and found him floating in the air, his body stiff and trembling. His eyes rolled back, and his mouth opened wide as a voice that wasn't his own screamed, "Darius Cole." The room erupted into chaos. Furniture flew across the space, and the walls seemed to pulse with a dark, liquid substance. Malik was thrown to the floor, unconscious but breathing. Terrified, the family ran to the front door, but it wouldn't budge. Every window, An exit was locked tight. Serena grabbed a fireplace poker and smashed it against the glass, but it didn't even crack. "Let us out," Darius shouted, his voice echoing through the house. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder now and filled with malice. The shadows that had once lingered in the corners now moved freely, circling the family like predators. Darius felt a sharp slap across his face, though no one was near him. Serena screamed as something cold tugged at her hair. The voices grew louder, overlapping until they were deafening. One stood out above the rest. "This is our house. You will never leave." The Cole family fled the cursed mansion as the first light of dawn broke over the hills. The moment they stepped outside, it was as if an invisible weight had been lifted. The oppressive air, the whispers, the cold, all of it was left behind, but the horror stayed with them. At a nearby hotel, Serena held Malik tightly, while Lila clung to her favorite doll. Darius stared out the window, his mind racing. He couldn't understand why this had happened. The house was supposed to be their dream home, a place to make new memories. Now it was a nightmare they might never escape. A haunting that follows. The Cole family tried to move on, but strange things kept happening. Malik had vivid nightmares of shadowy figures pulling him into darkness. Lila whispered to an imaginary friend she called the Lady, describing her as sad but nice. Serena complained of hearing faint whispers, even in their new hotel room. One night, Darius woke to find himself unable to move. A crushing weight pinned him to the bed as a dark figure loomed over him. It leaned in close, its voice like 1,000 whispers speaking at once. "You cannot run. This is not over." When he finally broke free, gasping for breath, Darius knew he couldn't ignore the house's hold over them. Uncovering the truth, Darius threw himself into researching the mansion's history. Late at night, he scoured old newspaper articles and archives, piecing together its grim past. The land had belonged to a group of women accused of witchcraft centuries ago. When the townspeople turned on them, the women were dragged to the mansion's grounds, tortured, and burned alive. Before their deaths, they cursed the land, vowing that anyone who tried to claim it would suffer as they had. The mansion itself was built years later by a man named Thomas Elbridge, a wealthy industrialist with a shady reputation. He disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and subsequent owners reported eerie occurrences, objects moving on their own, doors slamming shut, and apparitions roaming the halls. Families who lived there rarely stayed for more than a few months. The final clue came from an old diary Darius found in an online archive. It belonged to a maid who worked in the mansion during Elbridge's time. She wrote of hearing voices in the night, of her employer talking to shadows as if they were people, and of seeing a boy floating in the air, screaming words that weren't his own. Darius's blood ran cold. The story sounded eerily similar to what had happened to Malik. Seeking help, desperate for answers, Darius sought out experts in the paranormal. He found Evelyn, a renowned medium, and a team of investigators willing to confront the mansion. Evelyn was skeptical at first, but agreed to help when Darius described the events. "You're dealing with more than just spirits," Evelyn said. "This is something ancient and powerful. If we go in, we might not come out." Darius didn't care. "I need to protect my family. Whatever it takes." The return to the mansion. Darius and the team arrived at the mansion under the cover of darkness. The house loomed before them, its windows like hollow eyes. The air grew colder as they approached, and a feeling of dread settled over them. Inside, the mansion seemed even darker and more oppressive than before. Evelyn lit candles and set up a circle of protection in the grand living room. "We're going to make it reveal itself," she said. "But be prepared. It will fight back." The team set up their equipment: cameras, motion sensors, and audio recorders. Almost immediately, they picked up activity. Footsteps echoed in the halls. Doors creaked open and shut, and cold drafts swept through the room. The summoning. Evelyn began her ritual, chanting in a low voice. The air grew heavy, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and twist. The motion sensors blared as an invisible force moved through the house. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from upstairs. One of the investigators, Jake, went to check it out. Moments later, they heard his scream. Darius and Evelyn rushed to find him. They discovered Jake in a hallway, staring at a mirror. His reflection was grinning, even though his face was contorted in terror. "It's watching us," Jake whispered. "It knows we're here." As they pulled Jake back to the living room, the temperature plummeted. Evelyn's candles flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. From the shadows, a voice boomed. "Why have you returned?" The team froze as a figure emerged, a towering shadow with burning red eyes. It looked at Darius and laughed. "You brought me a gift," it said, gesturing toward the stairs. To Darius's horror, Malik stood at the top of the staircase. His eyes were blank, and he walked toward the entity as if in a trance. "Malik!" Darius shouted, but an invisible force held him back. The horrifying twist. Evelyn screamed, "The boy is the key. It's using him." Darius struggled against the unseen force, yelling for his son. Malik stopped in front of the entity, and his voice, cold and unrecognizable, spoke. "He brought us here. He's ours now." Darius realized the truth. The mansion wasn't just haunted. It was alive, feeding on the fear and pain of its victims. Malik, with his vulnerability, had become its anchor. "You can't have him," Darius shouted. The entity roared, and the room erupted into chaos. Furniture flew across the room, and shadows swirled around them. Evelyn, desperate, began chanting louder. The entity screamed in rage as her words grew stronger. The final confrontation. Malik suddenly collapsed to the floor, unconscious. The entity turned its attention to Darius, lunging at him. Darius grabbed a broken piece of wood from the floor and swung it wildly, passing through the shadowy figure. "Fight it, Malik," Evelyn screamed. "You have to fight it." Malik opened his eyes, tears streaming down his face. He whispered, "Leave us alone," and a brilliant light filled the room. The shadows screamed and dissolved as the mansion trembled violently. The walls cracked, and the air became still. The aftermath. When the light faded, the team found themselves outside the mansion, unharmed but shaken. The house stood silent and lifeless. Evelyn explained that Malik's willpower had severed the entity's connection to the mansion. The curse was broken, but the land remained tainted. The Cole family moved far away, leaving the mansion behind. It was eventually demolished, but locals claimed that on certain nights, faint whispers can still be heard where it once stood. The Cole family would never forget the nightmare they survived. And though they were free, they knew the mansion's darkness would linger forever.